Hi everyone and welcome back to the garden. In today's video I'm talking about bamboo, the biggest and the best varieties you can grow in cooler climates like the UK, and also some tips I put together to help you get the biggest canes and the most impressive plant in the shortest amount of time. So if you don't know a lot about bamboo, they're an amazing tropical effect plant, great in any kind of exotic or jungle garden, and for me they're one of the most impressive plants that you can grow. Sure, tree ferns are beautiful, tetrapanax and bananas are really striking, but there's something about a mature bamboo that towers over you with really thick culms that are so impressive and an awesome plant to grow. Personally, I grow a lot of different bamboos in the garden. Some are great for screening, others I've got the far end of the garden as a windbreak, some go well at the back of borders, and others have got the presence and the sheer beauty to be great standalone specimen plants. In my last video, I talked about the differences between running and clumping bamboos, and obviously clumping bamboos are a sensible choice. They stay neat, they grow predictably, they're not an invasive plant, and they're never going to disappear underground and come up in your neighbour's garden or somewhere you don't want them to. So really, whilst they're the sensible choice, if you want those big canes, if you want a really impressive giant plant, then you need to turn to the dark side and choose a runner. So that leads neatly on to my first point of the day, which is if you want a big bamboo, the variety you choose is really important. Probably the single biggest factor in how big your bamboo can eventually get is the variety you choose to plant in the first place, so it really is important. A lot of them can all look similar when they're small, runners, clumpers, but the reality is each of them has got its own potential built into it, the potential height and the potential cane size. When I'm usually recommending bamboos, Fargesia robusta Campbell is probably one of my favourite varieties. It stays neat, it stays compact, and it is a clumper. So although it can get to 4 metres tall, those canes or culms never really get chunky, and it doesn't have that stereotypical bamboo look that you probably wanted to create in your garden. So although it's a very handy plant, a very useful plant, great for at the back of borders and near boundaries where it's not going to suddenly escape, the reality is if you want a big bamboo, then you need to choose a variety that's got the potential to actually grow big in the first place. The biggest, tallest, fastest growing bamboos all grow in the tropics, and some of them get absolutely massive, with each individual cane being bigger than most trees are here. They're absolutely huge things. But the reality is, if you go on eBay, buy some seeds of these, well firstly, if you buy any bamboo seeds or anything weird and wonderful like that, chances are they're not going to be the plant you actually expect them to be. And the reality is, even if they do germinate, even if they are genuine, then you'll get them growing alright at first, but really we won't have the summer heat in places like the UK to really get the big plants you're actually dreaming of. And also, a sad reality is they won't make it for our winters. They just don't have that hardness they need to survive from year to year. So although it might be a fun experiment to grow the biggest bamboo, to grow the fastest bamboo, in reality the plant's going to get to a certain size and you won't have the greenhouse or space in your house that's tall enough to keep it growing through winter. If you do a bit more research, you'll find there's varieties like Phylostachys adulis and some of the Shanghai varieties that promise growth like maybe a smaller cousin of the real tropical varieties, but they've also got some cold tolerance built into them as well. And they've been proven to be tough in Central America, in some of the southern European countries. They can take the cold winters there. But the reality is they grow well there because of the summer heat they offer. Whereas in the UK, we just don't have that consistent high temperatures in summer that they really need to actually thrive and actually grow big. So whilst they were hyped up a lot at the time of their introduction, the reality is the results just haven't come in and they just don't do what you want them to do in our climate. Now there's always exceptions that prove the rule, and if you go down to Cornwall, there's gardens like Treba with some really massive examples of these, and they probably are the thickest canes you get in the UK. But the truth is that they've been there years and years, and they really take time to mature. So my recommended bamboo, the number one variety that I would recommend if you want to get canes in the UK, is Fertilising Vivax Aureocaulis, and I'll just show you that now. So if you look behind me, you'll see a few plants of Fertilising Vivax Areocaulis in my garden here. And although they're clumped together at the minute, that's purely because I only planted them out last year. I've ended up with 3 plants for a bit of a weird reason. I actually had one that I planted out at the old garden that I dug up as a clump and brought over, and the other one was planted in an absolutely massive pot, which although I somehow managed to get it into the back of a removal van, we got it to my girlfriend's house and I realised that it was never going to fit through the gate here, so I had to basically take a saw to it and chop the whole thing in half. But it's here now, it's been in the ground since last year. It will take a while to warm up and a couple of seasons to really get growing, but it's still a fantastic bamboo and it's going to look absolutely amazing here. So why is Vivax Areocaulis my top pick for a bamboo in the UK? Well, firstly, it doesn't need a lot of summer heat to really get growing, and also it doesn't need a lot of special care to get growing either. It's probably the best bamboo if you want an impressive looking plant that will size up without completely spoiling it and without us suddenly having baking hot summers every single year. Even without a lot of special care, in a spot that's not ideally suited to it, you can get a plant that's maybe 5-6 metres tall, with canes that are well over 25mm, an inch wide, so it still looks impressive without being in the perfect spot. Now, when you start to look after it, that's when things get really interesting. So if you plant it in the right spot, like I've tried to do here, if you give it plenty of feed, plenty of water, all the things that I'm going to talk about later in this video, then you can get a truly awesome plant. It really is one of the most awesome things that you can grow in your garden, and when you see a mature one of these, the culms, the canes, then get to over 50mm, maybe even 70mm, which just looks absolutely incredible, like it doesn't even belong in the UK. And when it comes to height, the Vivax has got that too. Like I said, if you don't look after them too much, they can get to 5 metres tall, but if you pamper them, if you feed them, have them in the right spot, you can get 7, 8, maybe 10 metres, probably even more than that. This is a bamboo that has the potential to grow to 15 metres or even taller in warmer countries. It's definitely got the potential to be an absolute giant and form a huge grove of these massive canes. Obviously in the UK it's going to be slightly slower and slightly smaller, but it's the fact that it doesn't need a lot of heat and a lot of special care to reach 50-75% of that potential. That's why it makes it such an awesome choice. And it's not just the golden one. In the garden here, I actually grow a few different varieties of this plant. So Phylostachys Vivax is the name, and that's the actual plain green form, which unusually is actually quite rare and harder to get hold of than the Aureocaulis. Personally, if I had to choose one, Areocaulis would be my favourite. Those golden canes are absolutely fantastic. You might see plants like Phylostachys Aurea being sold as golden bamboo, but the truth is they're more of a green, whereas it's plants like this Vivax Aureocaulis that really have a golden colour. And the green one, I think it's equally fantastic. Probably got the potential to get even bigger, maybe, but I do like that as well, so I've also got one next to it here in the garden. But if you want something a little bit different, something that not everyone will have, then you can actually look a bit further afield and go for a Phylostachys Vivax Huangwenzhu Inversa, which I'm glad I said it the first time because I don't want to do that bit over and over again, but it's an incredible plant. I'll put a link to it in the description below, Google it and you'll just see how incredible it is. It basically combines a bit of the Aureocaulis and the plain green Vivax and has canes that are a mixture of both, and it basically alternates between green and yellow. It looks an absolutely incredible plant. This is my plant of the plain green form, and I did actually mention this in my previous video, but to give you an idea of how fast the Vivax actually upsizes and grows, these were the size canes it's putting out in its first year, and the very next year it put out this cane here, which as you can see is already nearly 20mm, maybe probably pushing an inch wide, so the potential to grow quickly is definitely there with Vivax. There are other bamboo varieties that can get massive in the UK, but if you're wanting one that will thrive without a lot of care and has the potential with a bit of pampering to grow into a true monster, then Vivax would definitely be my choice. Whether you go for the plain green, the golden one, or one of the fancy varieties that's a mixture of both, you can't go wrong. They really are one of the most impressive plants, and if you put that in the ground now, within 5 years, without a lot of special care, you can have a plant that's 5 metres tall, maybe taller, with canes that are pushing 40 or 50mm. And if you pamper it a few more years later, maybe 6, 7, 8 years, you'll have an absolute monster of a plant that's 8 metres tall, canes maybe pushing 60, probably even 70mm, which is about the biggest you can get in the UK. So whilst the different forms of Vivax would definitely be my #1 choice if you're wanting to grow a big bamboo here in the UK, it's certainly not the only one. And if your bamboos are Fargesia, it's a clumper. If it's a Phylostachys, or Phyllostachys depending how you want to pronounce it, it's a running bamboo, and some of them can get absolutely massive. In the garden here, at the far end of the garden, I've got a Nigra Henonis, which is a huge plant potentially. I've also got further into the garden an Atrovaginata, which is supposed to have scented canes as it gets bigger and supposed to produce really chunky canes without them getting really tall. But probably the most exciting alternative I've got here in the garden is a Fertilising Parvifolia. Now at the minute it doesn't look massively impressive because I did plant it from a small plant, but it's definitely sized up from last year. The culms are already 3 times the size, and it's supposedly supposed to be a Moso bamboo, so your giant timber bamboo, but for colder climates. So I'm really excited after seeing pictures of mature examples of that. It produces a really attractive green plant, again really big canes on it, a dark green with white rings around them. That will be a second pick that not everyone's going to have in their garden. But in all honesty, if you can only have one, go for a Vivax, you definitely won't regret it. The next most important factor in trying to grow the biggest bamboo possible is the amount of space you've got to give it. So first off, I'll say you're never going to get a giant Phyllostachys by growing it in a pot. They're just not really suitable for pot culture. They'll survive, but they're never going to put out those really big canes you're actually growing it for. And I actually had this, well, one of these Aureocaulis in the pot at the old house. It was in a giant pot, maybe 500 or 750 litres, and even there, it only had canes that were pushing on 20 mil, so a fraction of what it's capable of, and it took a lot of watering too. The plants definitely do better in the ground, but even when they're in the ground, they need a fair bit of space. And I think it's sort of important to remember that a lot of these big timber bamboos, they're growing really big groves in the hotter countries, and that's how they actually get big. So if you're expecting them to produce a fairly decent size in your garden, you do need to give them a fair bit of ground to actually grow in. So I would recommend, as a general rule, if you imagine like the size of a sheet of ply or plasterboard, which is 8x4, or in new money about 2.4 by 1.2 metres, that really is the absolute minimum you need to grow a decent sized bamboo. And if you want to give it even more room to actually get some really big canes, I would probably suggest going up to maybe 10 square metres. Obviously, the more you give them, the better. And if you've got a far bigger garden than ours, and you can have them in the middle of a lawn as a specimen plant, if you can completely leave it to do its thing, that way you'll get the absolute biggest canes possible here in the UK. The right space though isn't just about the amount of ground you got available, and to really get a big Phyllostachys, you need to grow them in a spot that's got full sun, or close to full sun anyway, and a moist fertile soil. They don't like growing in a sandy soil that dries out very quickly, but equally they don't want to be waterlogged either. Obviously they're quite adaptable plants, but the reality is if you want to grow a big bamboo, it'll be so much easier if they're in full sun with a nice damp fertile soil. So that's really what you want to aim for. So if you bought a plant like a Vivax in a pot and you really want to get it to size up quickly, the right spot is absolutely essential. You need somewhere with enough room for it to grow, somewhere ideally in full sun and with a rich, moist soil. Not too much to ask for, is it? I think it's important to remember that the size of the canes that you've got in the pot that you bought haven't necessarily grown in that pot. It might be a division from a mature plant, likely it is. It's been in that pot a year or so to settle in and send up a few new canes, but the new canes that come up the following year won't be quite as big, and a new division can take a few years to actually get back up to that size. So although you can actually buy bamboos as really big canes in small pots, to actually get canes that size or larger, they need to be in the ground, and ideally they need to be in the right spot. So if you've got a Vivax bamboo or a big Phyllostachys like that, you want to put it in the ground, but you haven't got the room to really let it go wild and grow wherever it wants to go, you need to control it somehow. So I have actually done a video looking at the differences between running and clumping bamboos and a few methods that you can use to control them. But to summarise it in this video, the best way is to actually use a barrier. You dig it into the ground around that bamboo, or at least around the directions you want to stop it growing. So with my Vivax plants here, I've actually put a barrier between those and the palm border next to it. I will actually have a border all the way around it eventually, but it's going to take a lot of digging and it needs a lot of barrier, which isn't especially cheap, so it will get done down the line. But I would absolutely recommend, if you need to keep it controlled to an area that's maybe 10 metres squared, ideally use a barrier. The alternatives are to actually dig a trench around it and maintain that every single autumn to stop those rhizomes escaping out. Or if you've got it in an area of lawn right in the middle, you can actually mow around it. But obviously all that's going to do is just chop the culms down, and it won't stop those rhizomes creeping further out into your garden. So definitely it's all well me saying get the biggest space you can for your bamboo, but I think it's also important, if you haven't got unlimited space, like none of us really have, to actually control it somehow, or at least be mindful of how you can plan for it expanding in the future. The next tip on how you can grow the biggest bamboo possible in countries like the UK, probably not a surprising one, it's actually to feed your bamboo. And before I go through the exact methods and feeds that I'll be using over this year and the following years to grow my bamboos to the absolute ultimate size, it's probably important to tell you a bit about the general growing pattern of bamboos. So what bamboos do in early spring, they send up the new culms, they grow up, and then each culm actually leaves out around sort of May to July time. They grow the new leaves, and later in that year, from midsummer through to late autumn, the rhizome underground actually puts the real work in. All those new leaves are hard at work, taking in the sunlight, and that rhizome is charging up. All the sun, all the heat, all the water, all the nutrients, all go straight into that rhizome, which spreads underground, and it's that rhizome which actually forms the next year's shoots. So it's really important that you do everything you can to feed that rhizome, to create a happy plant. The most potential your bamboo's got is actually underground, and it's those rhizomes, those really big rhizomes, that produce the culms for next year. So what does that practically mean in terms of actually feeding your bamboo? Well, firstly, I see a lot of people commenting on Facebook, other sites like that, about how you need to feed your bamboo early spring, chuck loads of feed at it, and how that's the best method for creating a lot of growth. And whilst a bit of feed's definitely going to help, a bit of nitrogen's certainly going to help those leaves fill out and the canes grow really big and strong, the reality is a lot of that growth is already predetermined by the size of the rhizomes that actually spread and grew underground the previous season. So you're never going to get really big canes feeding it in spring, and a bit of feed's certainly going to help them leaf out. Yes, it's going to be great, but if you put too much feed in it, it's not going to be a good thing. It's just going to end up with bendy, floppy canes that aren't as strong. They might completely flop over. It's never going to produce the big canes you really want it to. So for my bamboos, I don't give them a lot of feed in spring. If they're in a good rich soil, I don't give them any sort of feed really. Personally, I tend to avoid lawn feed. I see it recommended a lot because it is high in nitrogen, but one thing that's really important to check, obviously you don't want to overdose them, but you can make things even worse if you put in a lawn feed that's also got a weed killer in it. You really want to check if you're going to put any sort of lawn feed on any tropical plant in your garden, make sure that it hasn't got a weed killer. It's absolutely essential, otherwise it'll create all kinds of problems. But when it comes to feeding, what I tend to do is feed at the back end of the season. And this isn't my idea, it's something I've read a lot about in the past on the various forums like Growing in the Edge. It's prioritise feeding at the back end of the year. So although you can give them a bit of nitrogen in spring, it's putting feed like bloodfish and bone, your chicken manure pellets down from midsummer right the way through to late autumn. That really helps the plant to build up that rhizome, and I really like the phrase charged up, which is what I read in a forum years ago. To me, it just sort of, really embodies that way that the rhizome just soaks in everything, all the nutrients, all the sun, all the water you can give it, and that's the way that you get big canes the following year. Just one thing I should add, when it comes to liquid seaweed, personally I don't use that in bamboos. I did read that it contains a lot of salt and they don't really like it. Whether it's actually true or not, I don't honestly know, but it does make sense, so I've actually avoided putting it on. In reality, it's those feeds like bloodfish and bone that really give your bamboo those balanced nutrients to help it growing at the back end of the year. But in one sense, the real magic isn't these feeds that come in bottles and sacks and tubs, it's actually in the soil itself. And in some ways, a lot of these extra feeds that you can give your garden in summer, sure, they definitely help plants come along, and if your soil's got natural deficiencies, they can help build those up. But in many ways, they're actually like taking vitamins, and vitamins can't substitute a proper diet. It's exactly the same with feeds. So really, the best thing that you can do for your bamboo to help create that rich soil, even if you've already got a rich soil, you can't go wrong adding more, is add organic matter at the back end of the year. So late autumn, manure, soil conditioner, anything like that is really great in improving that soil structure, its water retaining capacity, and the overall nutrients. It seriously is the absolute best thing you can do. And one thing, I actually saw this in Gardener's World, I think it was Simon Alpin a few years back, maybe more than a few years now, but he actually mounds up and pretty much creates a sort of compost heap around the base of the bamboo. So I've actually tried to do this here, chop down a lot of different weeds and other sort of vegetables from the garden, not vegetables, just general vegetation, and I put them all at the base of the bamboo. And the idea is they rot down, they provide all those nutrients going into the soil, it might even heat up the area a bit, but really it just creates a really rich environment for that bamboo to grow very strongly, and it's not actually negatively affected by having all that vegetation above it. But if you really want to go the extra mile, the best thing you can do is to keep those bamboo leaves, the ones that fall down and create an awful mess, actually leave those at the base of the plant. They seriously are the best single feed that you can give your bamboo, and it's quite obvious really when you think about it. Any plant's sort of spent leaves, the old dead leaves, they contain the nutrients, the building blocks that plant actually used to build them in the first place. So bamboo leaves contain a lot of silica. As they fall to the ground, you're giving that same silica to the plant that needs it. So really, a combination of organic matter, a few top-up feeds at the right times in the year, and creating a good rich soil with things like their own leaves and other vegetation, you're going to get a fantastic bamboo, and one that will grow bigger and stronger than one without any care. Following on from the last tip, my next tip is actually watering. And bamboos, like I said, they ideally need a good, rich, fertile, moist soil, but the reality is most of our gardens don't have that. So to help your bamboo along, you can certainly give it more water in dry spells. So when it comes to dry spells, I mean like this past spring, I actually watered mine a couple of times. I tend to water them maybe every week or so when it's dry and give them a real good soak in. And that way, the rhizomes and the roots don't stay too close to the surface. Because it's one of those things, if you water them every couple of days, they stay close to the surface and you create a plant that's more reliant on regular watering in the future. So if you give it a good deep soak in every week or so, that water goes right down. It will water the plant, but the plant will learn to go down further, to seek it out, and as it gets established, it will eventually become less reliant on watering. But even so, if you want the biggest bamboo possible, I would strongly recommend watering it in summer, give it an absolute good soaking every week or so, and your plant will grow so much better for it. I won't waffle on too much about the watering because it is fairly self-explanatory, but the more you give your plant in summer, the bigger and better it will grow. It really is as simple as that. And if you've got a sandy soil, if you've got a very free draining soil, you need to up your watering and give it even more to make up for that soil being dry in the first place. And if you're planting your bamboo in a raised bed, generally speaking, I wouldn't recommend that because the soil does dry out quicker. Obviously, the benefit is that a raised bed warms up quicker, so potentially that might help the rhizome. But because it drains quicker, you need to give it even more water. So anything you can do to improve how moist that soil is going to get you a bigger bamboo in a shorter time. My last tip for today's video, because 5 is a good number and also it's starting to get a little bit dark now, is actually patience. And I know that sounds a bit patronising, also slightly contradictory because the general theme of this video has been how to get the biggest bamboo possible in the shortest amount of time, but a bit of patience does help. Yes, they're the fastest growing plant in the world, but in the UK, our climate doesn't suit them perfectly, and like I've said, they do need a bit of help at the various times through the year to get them growing as big as possible, which means the feeding in the autumn to help them on there, and the watering in dry spells from spring through to autumn. Again, it really helps. You can shorten the time it takes for them to get massive, but they will still take a bit of time. The good news is that bamboos do size up very quickly, and personally I'd recommend, if you can, buy them as a small plant. And again, I do appreciate the irony of me saying this in a garden packed with massive specimen plants, but if you buy a small bamboo, it's cheaper and it sizes up very quickly. So generally, roughly speaking, if you plant bamboo in spring, it will grow that year. The new culms will probably be about half taller again than the original plant, and every year following that, the new culms can potentially be twice as tall, and that plant will maybe even get twice as wide as the original every single year. So they definitely size up quickly, whereas if you buy a big division of a mature plant, yes, you've got that instant impact, but what I found is they tend to take a while to grow, and it can take a few years for it to start putting canes out that are the same size as the original. If you've got some real patience and fancy a challenge, then yes, you can grow bamboos from seed. I've seen some really interesting varieties grown this way, but again, I'll probably just repeat, be careful about where you buy the seed from, because some places aren't as reputable as others. Definitely go to a place that you trust and choose a variety that, if you're planning to plant out in your garden, has a realistic long-term future here in the UK. So whether you choose to grow your bamboo from seed, from a small plant, or maybe a larger division, a bit of patience and consistency with all the watering, the feeding, and a bit of consideration into choosing that right spot initially, it'll definitely be rewarded in the long run. And when I say long run, bamboo size up very quickly. We're not talking about trees here, we're talking about something that literally doubles in height every single year, so you'll soon get to something that's 5 meters plus tall. I think bamboos are such an incredible group of plants, and I love everything about them, from the height of them, the different colours, the different leaves, the way they look from a distance. And I think even if I didn't grow the palms, the tree ferns, the bananas, all the exotic plants like that, I'd still have a bamboo or two in the garden to really bring that exotic flair. But above all else, it's the size of those canes that just really sort of fills you with awe. And if you go down to Cornwall, if you're ever lucky enough to go down there on holiday or something, it's definitely worth going to the Lost Gardens of Heligan, go to Treba, and there's some absolutely fantastic specimens there that can show you just how big a bamboo can get in the UK. So hopefully you've enjoyed my tips today, and if you've got any more, if you grow any varieties that have also grown big in your garden, then let me know in the comments below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.